first issue that I want you to address is the issue of genocide, or I think Richard Dawkins even calls it ethnic cleansing that God ordered. I just want to read a passage, and then I want you to respond to that. Um, I'm reading from Deuteronomy chapter 20, verse 16 to 18. It says, "Only in the cities of these peoples that the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance, you shall not leave alive anything that breathes, but you shall utterly destroy them, the Hittite, the Amorite, the Canaanite, and the Perizzite, the Hivite, and the Jebusite, as the Lord your God has commanded you, so that they may not teach you to do according to all their detestable things which they have done for their gods, so that you would sin against the Lord your God." There are other passages, I think, where God is giving similar instruction, and he's even there are places where he's telling, don't even kill the babies, kill the infants, kill the women, kill the livestock. So how would you respond to that?
Well, it's just so convenient that I have a book coming out that builds on my other book, Is God a Moral Monster? And also my book, Did God Really Command Genocide? Which I co-authored with Matthew Flanagan. And this is called, Is God a Vindictive Bully? So I'm using Richard Dawkins' own description. He uses moral monster, he uses vindictive bully. So I thank Richard Dawkins for giving me titles to my books. And so in that, I go into a lot of detail on a number of these issues, and go even beyond what I say in the Moral Monster book, in addition to covering a lot of new content, like Elisha and the bears, or the flood of Noah, or the firstborn of Egypt, to the imprecatory Psalms and so forth. So stay tuned for that. That's coming out in October. But when it comes to the question of genocide, well, one thing, genocide suggests that there is some sort of maybe ethnic agenda or ethnic hostility or something like that. And as you read the Old Testament, there's nothing inherently sinister about these different tribes, the Hittites, the Perizzites, and so forth. Many of them are part of Israel, like Uriah the Hittite, one of David's mighty men. Or you think of the Kenizzites. Well, Caleb was the son of Jephunneh the Kenizzite. You see, there are the Kenites, and of course we see the Kenites are actually friendly with Israel, and so there is not necessarily a hostility to them ethnically. The problem is that they are engaged in acts that would be considered criminal in any modern society. Think of, for example, incest, bestiality, infant sacrifice, ritual prostitution. Those were the things that these Canaanites were engaged in. The problem was not their ethnicity. The problem was that they were a pernicious influence, a corrupting influence. And what's more, God gave them over 500 years until their sin had been filled up. It would have been wrong for the Israelites to go into the land of Canaan before that time where their sin had reached full measure. And so God waits patiently. It includes Israel's being in Egypt during those 500 years. So there's still slavery in Egypt while God is waiting for that sin to be filled up. You also see that in what God has in mind, the judgment upon the Canaanites is simultaneous with bringing the Israelites into the land, establishing a culture and an identity that will usher in redemption for the entire world, including those who are the offspring of those very Canaanite peoples. So we, and all of the other enemies of Israel, we read about in chapter 19 of Isaiah, where the Assyrians and the Egyptians are incorporated into the plan of redemption that God has for his people. And so he identifies these foreigners and enemies of Israel now as his people, my people, he refers to them. We see the Jebusite, again, to those who lived in the region of Jerusalem, that the Jebusites also will receive salvation, the Psalms tell us. That the Philistines and others are going to be incorporated into God's redemptive purposes. So in the short term, there is judgment for this pernicious activity, again, that brings the Israelites into the land, but it has a longer term vision of salvation for all people, including those who have even been the enemies of Israel. But there's nothing ethnically hostile about it. Now, when it comes to the question of man, woman, young and old, etc., that you read from Deuteronomy 20, well, let's talk about that. And I go into a lot more detail on this in my forthcoming book. For one thing, keep in mind that Deuteronomy often intensifies the language of, say, Exodus and Numbers. So you'll sometimes see God is going to drive the hornet out, drive the Canaanites out with a hornet. And then that uses that same language in the book of Deuteronomy, but says, show them no mercy, destroy everything that breathes, and so forth. Well, as you look more closely, you see that that is a lot of rhetoric that is going on, a lot of hyperbole, which is common in the ancient Near East. But a more on the ground look at things tells us that there's something more going on. So let me give you an example. In Numbers 21, there is the fighting against kings Sihon and Og, these kings who the Israelites just want to pass through their territory without touching anything. They just want to pass through. And so Moses is requesting this, and these kings rise up and they say, no, you can't, and we're going to take up arms against you. So the chapter goes on to tell us that the Israelites fight against these armies. In fact, they describe Og's army. They say that they defeated the king, his sons, and his army. So an all-male army. So we think, okay, great. We understand that. And it's probably exaggeration is involved even in that they totally wiped them out. There's exaggeration language that's used in the ancient Near East, and we see that in the scriptures as well. Now, fast forward to Deuteronomy chapters 2 and 3. We saw in that same battle that is recounted later, we saw in the on-the-ground description that only adult males are fighting. But Deuteronomy intensifies the language, increases the rhetoric, and says that they, man, woman, young and old, they were all wiped out. Well, that's just how the language works. They weren't even any, old people. There weren't any women and children there. In fact, this army traveled 20 miles with their gear from the Arnon to the Jabbok rivers in this battle. So they're not going to have women and children going through this. It's difficult enough for a soldier to travel that distance, let alone women and children. So women and children aren't even there. And the same thing is true when you get to the Amalekites with Saul in 1 Samuel 15, where the Amalekites, again, who had been trying to wipe out the Israelites. So as one person has said, feeling sorry for the Amalekites is like feeling sorry for the Nazis. And so what happens is that, after the Amalekites had raided the Israelites it said in 1 Samuel 14:48, in chapter 15, Samuel, the prophet, tells Saul to wipe them out is the language that's used. And again, that question, what does the term utterly destroy mean? And it doesn't mean utterly destroy. It can be used for a number of things. Sometimes people can be left alive, even though there are, that term is used for them. So, but what is going on here? Well, Saul engages in battle at a citadel. There's a particular city, an Amalekite fortress. And it's interesting that Saul tells the Kenites, a friendly people to Israel, they're at this citadel, and Saul says, we don't want to have to fight against you. You're our friends. And so the Kenites end up getting up and leaving. So Saul then has a battle with the Amalekites. So surely there are not going to be any women and children there. But we're told that, man, woman, young and old, the narrator says that they were utterly destroyed, whatever that term means. And then we read later on in the book that David, once again, fights against the Amalekites. Chapters 27 and 30, he's fighting against the Amalekites. And what's interesting is that this is part of the rhetoric of ancient Near Eastern war texts, is that you'll have a battle at a certain city or a local region, and then you'll have mention of a vast conquest that goes along with that. So you have the individual battle in verse 5 that they fought in a city of Amalek. And then it says that Saul fought the Amalekites basically from Arabia to Egypt, which is a vast territory. We read the same thing when it comes to David. He fights a local battle. And then there is this vast terrain from Arabia to Egypt that he's fighting the Amalekites on. And we know that the Amalekites, there are like 400 of them who escape on camels and so forth. So clearly there is exaggeration, rhetoric going on here. So when we see, that man, woman, young and old, this is part of the sweeping language of ancient Near Eastern warfare. And as you start to look at the details, you realize, no, there's something more going on here, that there aren't even women and children there. What's happening? So that is something that is a part of the language that we need to come to terms with. And some people say, look, it's so clear. Well, I know we have that kind of language today where we, in sports teams, we say, we totally destroyed our opponents. We totally killed them and we annihilated them. Use that same sort of language. And you can have and basically what the term means, we utterly destroyed them. It just means we won the battle. That's what it means. It doesn't tell us the extent of people killed. It just means that there was a decisive victory.
Okay. And I think the proof of that is most of these nations who were supposed to be destroyed completely, they kept coming again in Judges and Kings and Samuel.
Right. Yeah. We're told that they could, the Israelites in Judges 1, they could not drive them out. 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 And we also see, and this is what's interesting about the scriptures, is that they recognize, they use the rhetoric of hyperbole that was common in the ancient Near East, but unlike the surrounding nations, they also mention that there are lots of survivors. In other ancient Near Eastern accounts, they would not mention the survivors. They'll say there were none left. But then they'll say, there were still people in that city, or the survivors went to such and such a city, from Ai to another place. So there are these, the scriptures give to us a more even realistic portrayal of what's going on than what other ancient Near Eastern did in their annals and war texts.
Equipped to talk to your friends about Jesus? Do you want to know more about God and His Word? Are you struggling with sin? And do you desire to pursue a holy life? Then this channel is for you.